Rain fell in thin gray sheets over the parking lot outside the pharmacy, and under the flickering streetlight, a woman in a plain dark coat stepped out with a small paper bag in her hand. 3 patrol cars converged before she reached the corner, tires hissing against wet asphalt, headlights sweeping across storefront glass. 3 officers stepped out, hands resting near their belts, eyes narrow with a suspicion that had no evidence behind it and never would. Within seconds, she was pressed against the hood of a cruiser, her cheek against cold, wet metal, because she looked, in their words, like someone worth stopping. A crowd gathered under umbrellas, phones raised, capturing every second, while one officer smiled the way men smile when they believe consequences belong to other people. The woman said nothing unkind. She simply waited, calm as still water, while the cold cuffs closed around her wrists. Then, once the metal clicked shut, she asked permission to reach into her coat, slow and deliberate, giving no one a reason to panic. She pulled out a small leather case, opened it without hurry, and let a gold badge catch the streetlight for every phone camera to see. The smiles disappeared instantly, replaced by something closer to dread. None of the 3 officers standing in that rain understood yet that their entire department had just entered its final hours, and that the woman they had humiliated on a public sidewalk had been sent there for exactly this moment. Her name was Monica Brooks, 42 years old, a black woman who carried herself like someone who had learned long ago that stillness could be its own kind of power. She worked for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, assigned to the Civil Rights Division, where her job was to find corruption hiding inside the very institutions built to prevent it. She rarely raised her voice, and she rarely needed to, because she had learned that silence, held long enough, made other people talk first. Colleagues described her as a woman who listened twice as much as she spoke, who noticed details other people walked past without seeing, who could sit in a room full of noise and still hear the one voice that mattered. She had spent nearly 15 years studying patterns of misconduct inside police departments scattered across the South, watching how power, left unchecked, tended to curdle into cruelty over time. She had walked into dozens of cities exactly like this one before, cities with tidy courthouse squares and magnolia trees and a police department everyone quietly feared but rarely discussed out loud. She did not enjoy the work, exactly, but she understood its necessity, the way a surgeon understands the necessity of a difficult incision. Somewhere behind her calm exterior lived the memory of every complaint she had ever read, every name attached to a story nobody in power wanted to hear. The city where she now stood was a mid-sized town, the kind with old brick storefronts, a courthouse square that still smelled faintly of magnolia in the evenings, and a police department with a reputation whispered about more than written down. That reputation described a force that was heavy-handed with anyone who did not look like the men who ran it, a force that treated certain neighborhoods as territory to be controlled rather than communities to be served. Arrest records, once pulled and analyzed, showed black residents stopped and searched at a rate nearly 4 times higher than white residents in those same neighborhoods, year after year, with no explanation offered and none demanded. Complaints had been filed for years, dozens of them, each one closed with the same 3 words stamped neatly across the folder: unfounded, insufficient evidence, case closed. Nobody outside the department seemed to ask why the pattern never changed, no matter how many names filled the complaint box, no matter how many families showed up at council meetings only to be thanked politely and dismissed. The mayor's office issued statements about ongoing reviews that never seemed to conclude. Local reporters wrote stories that ran once and disappeared. The department had learned, over years of practice, exactly how much scrutiny it could absorb without ever having to change, and it had grown comfortable inside that margin. Monica arrived in the city under the quiet cover of a legal conference, her name printed neatly on a laminated badge that said nothing about her real assignment. She checked into a modest hotel 3 blocks from the courthouse, attended panels on constitutional law and evidentiary procedure, nodded politely at strangers who had no idea what she carried folded inside her briefcase. Nobody in that city knew her actual purpose. Not the hotel clerk who handed her a room key, not the panel moderator who thanked her for a thoughtful question, not even the police officers whose paths she would soon cross beneath a streetlight. She had been sent quietly, deliberately, to observe a department that had spent 6 months under a federal microscope without ever once suspecting it. Before the conference, Monica had spent an entire afternoon at the federal field office 2 counties away, reviewing surveillance logs with a small team assembled specifically for this assignment. A data analyst named Patricia Hall had spread 3 years of traffic stop records across a conference table, color-coded by neighborhood, by shift, by the badge number of the officer who signed each report. The pattern had been undeniable even before Monica arrived in the city. But patterns on paper rarely moved a courtroom the way footage did, and everyone in that room understood the difference between a statistic and a witness. A supervisor named Grant Alvarez had briefed her one final time before she checked into the hotel, reminding her that nothing about this assignment required her to provoke anything, only to exist in the city long enough for whatever was already happening there to happen to her too. She had nodded, gathered her bag, and told him she had done this kind of quiet waiting before, in cities that looked almost exactly like this one. Meanwhile, across town, the night patrol shift prepared for another ordinary evening, unaware that ordinary was about to end for all of them before the night was through. At the center of that shift stood Officer Derek Collins, a man built from confidence and habit in equal measure, the kind of officer who mistook authority for infallibility and had never once been forced to learn the difference. Collins had worked the streets for 11 years, decorated twice for bravery, reprimanded rarely and never seriously, and never once, in his own mind, wrong about anything that mattered. He believed instinct was evidence enough to justify almost any action he chose to take. He believed a raised eyebrow, a certain posture, a certain kind of walk down, a certain kind of street justified a stop, a search, a demand for identification. His colleagues respected him the way people respect anything loud enough to drown out doubt, and beneath that respect sat a quieter truth nobody dared say aloud in the locker room or the break room. This was not one bad night waiting to happen to one unlucky woman. This was a culture, built brick by brick, shift by shift, complaint by dismissed complaint, until it became load-bearing in every corner of the department. Younger officers learned it from older ones, absorbing the unspoken rules the way apprentices absorb a trade, until suspicion itself became a kind of muscle memory nobody thought to question. The conference ended a little after 9 in the evening, and Monica walked the 6 blocks back toward her hotel beneath a sky heavy with rain that had not yet fallen. She wore a dark coat against the evening chill, carried a leather bag over one shoulder, and kept her stride even and unhurried, the way she always did after a long day spent listening to other people's certainty. She wore no makeup beyond what she needed for a professional room full of strangers, and nothing about her appearance suggested anything other than a tired attorney heading home after a long conference session. From 2 blocks away, half hidden in the shadow of a parked delivery truck, Derek Collins watched her walk past a darkened storefront, and something in his gut, the same gut that had failed him before without consequence, told him she did not belong there. "She's suspicious," he said into his radio, though nothing about her matched any description on record that night. Nothing about her posture or pace suggested anything but a woman eager to reach a warm hotel room. No call had come in reporting a crime in progress. No witness had described a suspect matching her clothing or her build. No lookout bulletin mentioned a woman in a dark coat walking briskly through a downtown sidewalk after a legal conference. There was only a feeling, dressed up as instinct, dressed up as policing. And Collins trusted that feeling, the way he always had, because it had never once been challenged before this exact night. The patrol car swung around the block, tires hissing against wet asphalt, and pulled alongside her with its lights spinning red and blue against the storefront glass. Monica stopped walking the moment the lights hit her, because she understood, better than almost anyone standing on that street, exactly how these moments could end if handled wrong. She had watched footage of encounters that ended badly for reasons no more substantial than the one unfolding around her now. The officers stepped out, hands resting near their holsters, voices sharp with commands before a single question had been asked, or a single crime named. "Raise your hands. Open the bag. Where is your identification?" She complied with each instruction, slow and deliberate, offering her hands first, opening the bag herself so no one could later claim she had resisted or reached for something dangerous. Collins searched through the bag anyway, pulling out papers, a phone, a set of keys, turning each item over as though something incriminating might fall out if he shook it hard enough. A small crowd began to gather on the far sidewalk beneath awnings and umbrellas, phones rising one by one to record what was unfolding beneath the streetlight. A man walking his dog stopped to watch. A woman leaving a late shift at a diner slowed her steps, phone already raised. Nobody intervened, because nobody ever did in moments like this, but nobody looked away either. The search turned into something closer to theater, Collins narrating his suspicions aloud for the benefit of no one and everyone at once. He raised his voice louder than the moment required, the kind of volume meant to perform authority rather than simply assert it. He used words that carried more insinuation than accusation, calling her evasive when she answered plainly, calling her defensive when she stood still and said nothing at all. A younger officer standing near the second cruiser hesitated, his hand hovering uncertainly near his belt, his eyes flicking between Collins and the woman he did not seem entirely convinced was dangerous. His name, though nobody in the crowd knew it yet, was Ryan Mitchell, 18 months into the job, and still young enough to notice when something felt wrong. Collins caught the hesitation in his rookie's face and crushed it instantly, the way he had crushed every small doubt that had ever threatened his authority on a street corner. "Cuff her," he said, flat and final, the kind of order that left no room for a rookie's uncertainty to grow into a question. Ryan hesitated only a fraction of a second longer before reaching for his own cuffs, his movements stiff, his jaw tight, the muscles in his hands betraying a reluctance his mouth was too afraid to voice out loud. Monica asked the only question that actually mattered in that moment. "Am I under arrest?" Collins answered without looking at her directly, already reaching for the cuffs at his own belt, as though the question were beneath, answering carefully, "Not yet." The cuffs closed around her wrists anyway, cold and tight, though the law required an arrest to be declared before restraint could be justified, and no arrest had been declared by anyone standing on that street. No one read her rights. No one explained the charge, because there was no charge, only a feeling that had calcified into action long before anyone paused to question where that feeling had come from. Monica did not raise her voice, did not pull away, did not give them a single reason to escalate further than they already had. She simply stood there, spine straight, chin level, eyes steady, while a dozen phone cameras recorded a woman being restrained for the apparent crime of walking home calmly after a long day of work. Rain began to collect on her shoulders, running in small rivers down the dark fabric of her coat, and still she said nothing that could be twisted into a justification for what was happening to her. A woman near the edge of the crowd, an off-duty nurse named Deborah Simmons, stepped closer and called out that she had seen the entire thing from the start, that the woman in the coat had done nothing but stand still and answer every question asked of her. Collins told her to step back, his voice sharper now, aimed at the crowd instead of at Monica, as though the real threat that evening had suddenly become the people watching rather than the woman in handcuffs. Deborah did not step back. She simply raised her phone higher and kept recording. Her jaw set the way people's jaws set when they decide, quietly and firmly, that they will not look away this time. Other onlookers began murmuring the same thing to each other, comparing notes in real time, building among themselves an informal record of events that would later match, almost word for word, the footage investigators eventually reviewed. 10 minutes passed, filled with radio chatter and the low murmur of onlookers whispering to each other beneath their umbrellas, some already texting friends about what they were witnessing. Monica finally spoke again, her voice even, almost gentle, the way someone speaks when they have made this exact calculation many times before in many different cities. "May I reach my inside pocket?" Collins, perhaps sensing the crowd's growing unease pressing against the edges of the scene, perhaps simply out of ingrained habit, nodded and allowed it without much thought. She reached in slowly, every motion deliberate, giving him no excuse and no surprise, and pulled out a slim leather case worn soft at the edges from years of quiet use. She opened it without hurry, letting the gold shield catch the streetlight directly, letting the federal seal sit in plain view for every phone camera angled toward her to capture clearly. Beneath the badge sat her credentials, her real name printed beside two words that changed the entire meaning of the last 20 minutes for everyone standing in the rain: Civil Rights Division. The crowd went silent almost immediately, the kind of silence that arrives when everyone realizes at once that the story they are filming has just become something else entirely. Collins's face drained of color in the space of a single breath, his mouth opening without sound, coming out for what felt like a very long moment. Somewhere behind him, a flashlight slipped from another officer's hand and clattered against the wet pavement, the sound unnaturally loud against the sudden hush. Ryan Mitchell's hand fell away from his own belt entirely, his eyes fixed on the badge as though trying to memorize every detail of it. Monica said only one sentence into the stunned quiet that followed, her voice no louder than before, no angrier than before, simply final. "I repeatedly identified myself." No one answered her, because there was nothing left to say that would not make things worse for the men standing around her. The rain finally began to fall in earnest, soft and steady, as though the sky itself had waited for this exact moment to release what it had been holding all evening. Somewhere in that crowd, a dozen phones kept recording, capturing footage that would travel far beyond this street corner before the night was over, shared and reshared until strangers hundreds of miles away knew the name of a department they had never heard of that morning. Most of the people watching believed the story had reached its ending right there beneath the streetlight. Badge exposed. Officers frozen. Justice apparently served in a single dramatic reveal. But nothing about that night had been an accident, and nothing about Monica's presence in that city had been left to chance or coincidence. For 6 months before that evening, the Bureau had quietly gathered testimony from residents who had grown tired of filing complaints that vanished into locked drawers without ever surfacing again. Investigators had collected footage from doorbell cameras positioned along patrol routes, pulled traffic stop data from state records, and mapped patterns across neighborhoods block by block until the numbers told a story no supervisor could keep denying with a straight face. More than 80 separate complaints had crossed federal desks in that window alone, each one describing some version of the same encounter, repeating itself with different names attached to nearly identical details. A young man stopped for walking too slowly near a jewelry store. A grandmother searched for carrying a bag that rattled with prescription bottles. A teenager handcuffed for standing outside his own front door. What happened to Monica that night was never the beginning of the investigation. It was the final piece, the one moment federal agents needed captured cleanly, without staging, without warning, exactly as it would have happened to anyone else who did not happen to carry a badge in their coat pocket. Collins had no idea, standing there soaked in rain and shame, that he had just handed investigators the cleanest evidence of the entire 6-month case against his department. He had performed, in full view of dozens of cameras and dozens of witnesses, the exact behavior that 80 complaints had already described, in careful, repetitive writing. He had done it to a federal agent whose only job that week had been to watch and wait and see whether the pattern held true one final time before the file closed for good. By morning, the quiet town found itself hosting visitors it did not expect and could not turn away no matter how many calls the mayor's office made. Federal agents arrived first, moving through the department's front doors with a calm that unsettled everyone who saw it, followed by representatives from the Department of Justice carrying binders thick with 6 months of accumulated evidence. Internal affairs investigators from a neighboring jurisdiction arrived shortly after, brought in specifically because local trust in oversight had collapsed years earlier, and nobody believed the department could investigate itself honestly anymore. Preservation orders landed on desks before the coffee had finished brewing in the station break room, demanding every piece of evidence connected to the department be frozen exactly as it stood the moment the orders were signed. Body camera footage, radio transcripts, arrest logs stretching back 3 full years, internal emails, text message threads, dispatch recordings, training records, all of it suddenly untouchable under federal seal and federal watch. Officers who had grown used to controlling their own paperwork found themselves locked out of systems they had once treated as private property. The chief of police at the time, a heavyset man named Gerald Ochoa, who had held the position for nearly a decade, called an emergency meeting inside his office before the sun had fully risen that morning. He stood at the head of a long table, addressing captains and lieutenants who had, until that moment, always looked to him for reassurance that whatever storm was coming would eventually pass the way every previous storm had passed before it. This time his voice carried none of its usual certainty, and several officers in that room later admitted they understood, watching him struggle for words, that nothing about this situation resembled the complaints they had weathered in years past. Ochoa ordered everyone to cooperate fully with federal investigators, a directive that arrived roughly 6 hours too late to undo anything that had already been logged, copied, and secured somewhere far outside the building's own servers. Patricia Hall, the analyst who had spent months mapping traffic stop data long before Monica ever checked into her hotel, flew into the city that same morning to assist the incoming investigative team directly on the ground. She sat for 16 hours straight, cross-referencing dispatch logs against arrest records, occasionally pausing only to eat a sandwich someone had left on the corner of her borrowed desk. By evening, she had built a timeline so precise that investigators could trace, almost to the minute, when certain reports had been altered and by which login credentials the changes had been made. Her work, quiet and largely invisible to anyone outside the investigation, became the backbone that every later courtroom argument rested upon without most of the public ever learning her name. Panic moved through the department faster than any official statement could contain it or slow it down. A handful of officers reportedly considered deleting files from shared drives late that same morning, or quietly rewriting incident reports to soften language that had once seemed harmless enough to leave unchanged. One sergeant allegedly attempted adjusting timestamps on an arrest log from several months earlier, hoping to obscure a pattern he had helped create without ever naming it as a pattern in his own mind. He discovered, far too late, that federal investigators had already secured a mirrored copy of every server months before Monica had ever set foot in the city at all. Another officer, a 12-year veteran named Bruce Whitfield, spent the better part of that first chaotic morning trying to reach a union representative on the phone, convinced that whatever was unfolding could still be managed the way earlier controversies had always been managed before. He learned by early afternoon that the union representative had already been contacted separately by federal investigators, and that any advice he might receive would come wrapped in far more caution than reassurance. Whitfield sat alone in the break room for nearly an hour that day, staring at a cup of coffee gone cold, running through 11 years of stops and searches in his mind, trying to recall which ones might now look different under a stranger's careful review. Every keystroke, every edit, every late-night login attempt had already been logged somewhere, agents controlled entirely, not the department, not any officer inside it. The illusion of control the department had enjoyed for years evaporated within 72 hours of that rainy encounter beneath the streetlight, leaving officers who had never once feared consequences suddenly staring directly at them. What investigators uncovered went far beyond one officer's bad judgment on one wet street corner on one ordinary Tuesday night. Reports had been quietly altered over years to justify stops that never had legal grounding in the first place. Language shifted just enough to survive a cursory review. Body camera footage showed gaps exactly where questionable force had been used, footage mysteriously interrupted or corrupted at conveniently timed moments that investigators no longer believed were accidents. Arrests had been logged using language crafted specifically to survive scrutiny, phrases repeated so often across different officers' reports that investigators suspected coaching rather than coincidence. A shared script passed quietly from veteran to rookie. Excessive force complaints, when they were not buried outright in some forgotten filing cabinet, were quietly settled with confidentiality agreements that kept victims silent and payouts hidden from public budget reviews entirely. Officers who had tried raising concerns internally, years before Monica ever arrived, found themselves reassigned to worse shifts, passed over for promotion without explanation, or simply frozen out of the informal networks that made the job survivable day to day. The department had built, without ever calling it by name, a system that rewarded silence and punished conscience. The corruption reached higher than Derek Collins alone, threading upward through a chain of command that had protected itself for years through simple, quiet complicity. A lieutenant named Frank Dawson had signed off on reports he never read carefully enough to question, trusting the officers beneath him precisely because questioning them would have meant confronting a truth he preferred not to see. Two shift captains had quietly discouraged officers from documenting incidents that might draw outside attention, framing caution as loyalty, and loyalty as the highest virtue the job required. A deputy chief, a man named Robert Hale, had personally advised subordinates on how to phrase incident reports to avoid triggering federal review thresholds entirely. According to internal messages, investigators later recovered from a backup server nobody had thought to check. Each of them had believed themselves insulated by rank, by seniority, by the simple, comfortable fact that nobody outside the department had ever successfully challenged them before that rainy night. Their confidence had been built on decades of complaints disappearing quietly into locked drawers, and they had never once imagined a single evening could unravel all of it at once. Investigators also uncovered a smaller, quieter scandal buried inside the larger one, a pattern of officers accepting favors from a handful of local business owners in exchange for aggressive patrols around their storefronts. A pawn shop owner named Wallace Perry had, for nearly 2 years, provided free equipment and occasional cash gifts to officers willing to treat the block outside his store as a personal jurisdiction, chasing away anyone he found unwelcome regardless of whether they had broken any law. None of it had ever appeared on a single incident report, because none of it had ever been meant to. When investigators finally traced the pattern back to its source, Perry cooperated quickly, eager to avoid charges of his own, and his testimony closed several remaining gaps in the timeline that federal analysts had struggled to connect using footage alone. Ryan Mitchell, the same rookie who had hesitated the night Monica was cuffed on that sidewalk, made a decision in the days that followed that would matter more than he understood at the time he made it. He came forward voluntarily, walking into a federal field office with a folder under his arm, turning over emails he had saved without fully knowing why he had kept them. He handed over screenshots of text threads where superiors joked about which neighborhoods to patrol harder, internal memos hinting at quotas disguised carefully as productivity goals, and a handwritten note from a supervisor telling him not to worry so much about paperwork nobody would ever read closely. Everything he handed over matched, detail for detail, the patterns investigators had already mapped from 80 prior complaints filed over the preceding years. His name, and his willingness to speak plainly about what he had witnessed and participated in, did not save him from his own scrutiny. But it did something the department had not expected from any of its own. It gave the case a human face willing to say, clearly and on the record, that the culture Monica had exposed was real, was deliberate, and had been built long before she ever arrived in the city. The public hearing filled the city council chambers long before the scheduled start time, every seat taken. Reporters lined against the back wall with cameras balanced heavily on their shoulders. Attorneys sat beside grieving families who had waited years for anyone in a position of power to finally look their way and take their complaints seriously. Community organizers who had spent a decade demanding reform sat quietly near the front, some holding photographs of relatives who had never gotten this kind of public attention for what happened to them. Among them sat a woman named Loretta Banks, whose nephew had been arrested 3 years earlier under circumstances nearly identical to what happened to Monica, though his case had never once drawn a camera or a headline. She had attended every council meeting since that arrest, spoken during public comment more times than she could count, and watched her complaints get filed away with the same 3 dismissive words used on every other case. She had not expected, walking into the chamber that morning, that the hearing would finally include her family's story alongside so many others. But when the prosecutor read a summary of prior complaints into the record, her nephew's name appeared among them, spoken aloud in a public chamber for the first time in 3 years. She did not cry until she was outside the building afterward, standing alone on the courthouse steps, finally able to exhale after years of holding her breath. The footage from that rainy street corner played first, silent, except for the ambient hiss of rain and the low murmur of Collins's voice demanding compliance from a woman already fully complying with every instruction given to her. Watching it unfold on a large screen at the front of the chamber, stripped of context, stripped of excuse, made the room go still in a way that written reports and dry statistics never quite managed to achieve on their own. After the footage from that night finished playing, investigators presented the wider evidence, layering additional body camera clips against store surveillance video and GPS data pulled directly from patrol vehicle systems. Timestamps that officers had once claimed supported their version of events instead contradicted them minute by minute, second by second, in front of a room full of witnesses and cameras. Collins attempted to explain his actions from the witness stand, insisting his instincts had been sound, insisting the situation had required a caution that only years of experience could properly justify to anyone unfamiliar with the streets. Each explanation he offered collapsed the moment prosecutors replayed the footage beside it, his own recorded words undermining the calm story he tried to construct in the present. Whatever trust the community had clung to, however thin it had already worn over years of dismissed complaints, finally gave way entirely inside that chamber, replaced by something closer to quiet, exhausted anger. Deborah Simmons, the off-duty nurse who had refused to lower her phone that rainy night, testified next, describing calmly what she had witnessed from 20 feet away with no obstruction and no reason to lie. Her account matched the footage exactly, detail for detail, and she added one observation that seemed to settle over the room heavier than anything else said that day. She told the council that in 11 years living 3 blocks from that pharmacy, she had watched some version of that same stop happen to at least 6 other people she personally knew, none of whom had ever been carrying a federal badge in their pocket. She said she had filed a complaint after one of those earlier incidents herself and had never once received a response. The chamber went quiet again, differently this time. The silence of people recognizing that the woman on trial that day was never truly the only victim in this story, only the one whose case finally could not be buried. Weeks later, the Department of Justice released its findings in a report that ran to several hundred pages, detailing patterns of unconstitutional stops, falsified documentation, and retaliation against officers who had tried to report misconduct through proper channels. 9 officers faced formal suspension. 4 faced criminal charges ranging from falsifying records to civil rights violations, and 2 lost their certifications permanently, barred from ever wearing a badge again in any jurisdiction within the state. The deputy chief resigned quietly before the report's public release, avoiding cameras entirely on his way out of a building he had once run with near total authority. Within a month, The entire command structure of the department had been dismantled and rebuilt from outside leadership brought in specifically to avoid the old loyalties that had allowed the culture to persist for so long. The city agreed to a court-supervised reform plan, complete with retraining programs, revised use of force policies, mandatory data reporting on every stop and search conducted, and an independent oversight board with real subpoena power for the first time in the department's long, quiet history. Gerald Ochoa resigned the same week the Department of Justice report became public. Reading a brief statement to a small cluster of reporters gathered outside the station he had led for nearly a decade. He did not apologize directly, choosing instead to speak in careful phrases about accepting responsibility for systemic failures that had occurred, in his words, under his watch rather than by his direct design. Few in the crowd believed the distinction mattered much, and fewer still repeated his statement without noting how carefully it avoided the word wrong. He left the building that afternoon through a side entrance, avoiding the cameras stationed at the front, and was never again seen in any official capacity connected to law enforcement in that state. Monica never gave a lengthy statement to the press throughout any of it, never appeared eager to claim credit for what unfolded after that single rainy night beneath a flickering streetlight. When reporters pressed her outside the courthouse following the hearing, microphones crowding close around her face, she offered only a single sentence, delivered without heat or triumph in her voice. Accountability protects everyone. She said it plainly, the way she said most things that mattered, and then she walked past the cameras without another word, leaving the reporters to fill their broadcasts with whatever meaning they chose to attach to those 3 words. Months passed, and the department that had once quietly terrified its own citizens began to look, cautiously, like something new was actually taking root inside it. New officers walked the same streets under new leadership, trained under revised policies that required documented justification for every stop, every search, every use of force before it could be logged as closed. Body cameras that had once mysteriously malfunctioned at convenient moments now streamed directly to an independent server outside the department's control, reviewed weekly by members of the new oversight board. Implicit bias training, once treated as a checkbox exercise squeezed into a single afternoon, became a mandatory component woven into every training cycle, revisited quarterly rather than forgotten after one session and never mentioned again. Slowly, residents who had stopped calling the police out of fear began speaking with officers on their own porches again, tentative but present, testing carefully whether the change happening around them was real or simply cosmetic dressed up for cameras. A few families who had filed complaints years earlier finally received letters acknowledging what had happened to them. Letters that arrived far too late to undo the harm, but early enough to mean something all the same. Loretta Banks received one of those letters on a quiet Thursday afternoon, opening it at her kitchen table with hands that trembled slightly as she read the department's formal acknowledgement of what her nephew had experienced years before. She placed the letter in a drawer beside an old photograph of him, not because the words fixed anything that had already happened, but because for the first time since his arrest, someone in an official capacity had finally admitted, in writing, that he had been telling the truth all along. The new Independent Oversight Board held its first public session on a warm evening in early autumn, attended by more residents than any council meeting the city had hosted in over a decade. Members of the board, chosen specifically from outside the department's old network, reviewed a stack of body camera footage from the preceding month, checking each stop against the newly required documentation standards. They found the vast majority compliant, a handful requiring follow-up questions, and one requiring formal review, a ratio that would have been unthinkable under the old command structure barely a year earlier. Residents in attendance applauded quietly at the end of the session, not because the work was finished, but because for the first time in longer than most of them could remember, someone was actually watching closely and writing down what they saw. Monica returned to Washington not long after the hearings concluded, back to an office that looked much like it had before she left, stacks of files still waiting patiently on the corners of her desk. A colleague, curious about the toll 6 months of quiet surveillance must have taken on her, asked her one evening over coffee if it had all been worth the cost to her personally. She looked out the window for a moment before answering, watching the lights of the city flicker against an early evening sky the color of faded denim. It was never about one arrest, she said finally, her voice quiet but entirely certain of itself. It was about changing what everyone thought could never change. Somewhere far south, in the town where it had all begun on a rainy sidewalk outside a pharmacy, a maintenance crew removed the old department sign from its post outside the station, replacing it with something newer, something that no longer carried the invisible weight of 80 unanswered complaints behind its lettering. The building looked much the same from the outside. Brick and glass under an ordinary sky, cars parked in the same familiar rows along the same cracked pavement. But everything inside it now answered to eyes that had not been watching before, to systems that no longer forgot as conveniently as they once had. Officers who once believed themselves above scrutiny now filed reports knowing someone, somewhere, would actually read them carefully and ask questions if the details did not line up. Ryan Mitchell stayed on the force, promoted quietly within the first year of reform, often the first to remind newer recruits why documentation mattered more than instinct alone. Nobody in that city forgot the rainy night. A woman in a plain dark coat had been cuffed on a public sidewalk for the crime of simply walking home from a conference on a Tuesday evening. Deborah Simmons kept the original footage from her phone long after the trial concluded, storing it carefully the way some people store letters from relatives who have passed, not because she needed to watch it again, but because she understood its weight. She told a local reporter, in one of the only interviews she ever agreed to give, that she had not filmed that night hoping to become part of any larger story. She had simply refused, in that particular moment, to let a woman disappear quietly into a system that had disappeared so many people before her without consequence. Her footage, stitched together with dozens of other clips from strangers she never met, became part of a training module the new department eventually used to teach incoming officers exactly what unlawful escalation looked like from the outside, frame by frame, second by second. Derek Collins never worked in law enforcement again, his certification revoked permanently by a state board that reviewed his record alongside the footage from that night and found nothing left to defend. He moved out of the county within a year, according to public records, and declined every request for comment that followed him afterward. Robert Hale, the deputy chief who had once advised his officers on how to phrase their way around federal scrutiny, faced his own separate hearing months later, his calm authority replaced by the same defensive stammering he had once mocked in weaker men beneath him. Frank Dawson retired quietly under a cloud he never fully escaped, his name occasionally resurfacing whenever residents discussed how long the old system had been allowed to run unquestioned. A single federal badge did not, on its own, tear down an entire police department built over decades of habit and silence. It was the years of unchecked power, the quiet culture of assumption dressed up as instinct, the falsified reports and buried complaints stacked one on top of another, that finally collapsed under the weight of their own construction. Monica Brooks had not set out to destroy anything that particular night beneath the streetlight. She had only waited, calm and unhurried, for the truth to reveal itself exactly as it always eventually does, whenever someone finally stops long enough, and stays long enough, to actually look.